Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our talk this evening. I'm Peter Jameson and the chairman of the Friends of Czech Heritage. Tonight, we have not one, but two speakers. We are very privileged to have both Martyn Bond and Claudia Hamill addressing us. Martyn has enjoyed three careers: as a journalist with the BBC, where he was their Berlin correspondent. As a European civil servant, he ran the European Parliament office and was spokesman for the Council of Ministers. Between 2005 and 15, he was visiting professor at Royal Holloway College, amongst other academic posts, and has published numerous books on European matters. His latest being Hitler's Cosmopolitan Bastard, about Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, which is the subject of our talk tonight. The book is a must and should be read by all hardened Brexiteers. May I commend it to you? Claudia shares Martyn's enthusiasm about the Count and has worked closely with him. She was the National Trust European and Overseas Director, helping to organize a European network of heritage organizations, and has had experience working with the EU structure, and has recently lectured at Maastricht University, in a council member of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. So, the Count has two loyal supporters with impeccable credentials. The talk will now is split into three parts. The first is a video about the castle where the Count lived in Western Bohemia, very close to the German border. Claudia will take over, followed by Martyn. So now over to the technological side of things, and let us see this video. Thank you very much. I can't remember. Oh, Liz, perhaps I can get rid of this stuff down the bottom. Not Kalergi. After the
Thank you. Well, good evening, and thank you, Peter and Dave and Stephen and Jana for hosting this event. It's very good to be here with the Friends of Czech Heritage. I've looked at your website. I'm very impressed with the work you do. And I note that Ian Kennaway, my first boss at the National Trust in England, is involved in your activity. In preparing for tonight, I found I had two objectives. First was to publicise the story of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, and second, to stimulate you, perhaps to consider the castle as worthy of your support. And Martyn and I visited Pobřežovice, I hope I pronounced that properly, Zamek, in 2016, when we were researching this first English biography of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. And Martyn is its author, and I contributed with some research and editing. And our research in the Czech Republic also took us to Holzovský Teen Castle, Klatovy, and the archives at Pilsen. Could I have the first slide, please? We're going to share some thoughts on the castle of Pobřežovice, Richard, and the future of Europe. And I was fascinated, I think that's it, thank you. I was fascinated by the man and what he achieved. And I was equally intrigued by his father, Heinrich, and I loved the castle. The film has informed us of the early history of the castle. I'm going to take the story on from the start of the Coudenhove family involvement with it. Martyn will then provide details of what happened to the family, and in particular to Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi and his vision of the future of Europe. Richard was known as Dickie to his family, and we also use the abbreviation of his initials, RCK, in the book, because Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi is a bit of a mouthful, and I may possibly use both. Next slide, please. This is a map of where the castle is. As the film told us, and so did Peter, it's very close to the German border, and it's set in beautiful West Bohemia, a discovery for me. It's situated in the Domážlice district and has about 1,600 inhabitants. And the town centre is very well preserved and now protected by law as an urban monument zone. Next slide, please. The picture on the left is of the main street in earlier times, and it's still recognisable today. And on the right is an engraving of the castle. The association with the Coudenhove family started in 1857 with the marriage of the impecunious Franz Coudenhove to an heiress, Marie Kalergi. And Franz, a young diplomat in his first posting in Dresden, met Marie on a visit to Paris at her mother's famous salon. She was just 17 and he swept her off her feet. Next slide, please. And here she is, painted by Hans Mackert. Marie was the daughter of the favourite niece of Nesselrode, the long-standing Russian foreign minister, and that is where her fortune came from. It enabled Marie and Franz to start buying property, hunting estates in the Carpathians, and next slide, please. This castle, Ottensheim in Austria, near Linz, overlooking the Danube, which was Franz and Marie's main home. Their eldest son, Heinrich Coudenhove, had fathered a child, and its mother was refused admittance to the castle by Franz. When we visited, we were shown the window of Heinrich's bedroom, the turret, we were told. And below this is where the young mother, refused admittance, had then committed suicide. There was a scandal. In a mistaken attempt, a damaged imitation, Franz then published a short pamphlet defending his own and his son Heinrich's behaviour as excusable, on the basis that females from the lower orders, like horses, offered sport for the aristocracy. Heinrich was then sent to the furthest point of the Austro-Habsburg Empire to complete his university education at Czernowitz on the Russian border, near the Russian border, and then immediately abroad on a diplomatic career. Ottensheim was their castle nearest Vienna, and Ronsberg, as it was known then, was their country castle, a large working estate with farms, large forestry, and a watermill. And close by was Stockau, a former Cistercian abbey with fish ponds, and, next slide please, the Dianahof, a hunting lodge, also close to Ronsberg, deep in the forest, very near the German border. This was a country retreat from their country castle with fewer servants. Sadly, neither Stockwell nor Dianahof exists now. But next slide, please. Ronsberg, with its Czech name of Politicised, seen here in the model, does happily still exist. Stephen Conlin has kindly circled the castle buildings for us, with a tower in the middle, and to the left, there is a long building outside the circle, running north to south, which was its stable block. And at its southern tip, there is a visitor centre. Next slide, please. This is the current visitor entrance with 2 plaques. I'll return to those right at the end of the story here that I'm saying. And this leads now to, next slide, please. The steps up to the main facade and entrance at the time of the Coudenhove-Kalergis. In fact, the 2 names were only linked together in use by Heinrich shortly before his death at the beginning of the 20th century. Next slide, please. The video showed us the castle in the context of the beautiful Japanese garden, created thanks to Madame Meraki, living in Munich, whom we met when who wrote a German biography of Richard's Japanese mother. And here you see the front entrance facade. The first impression is that it looks very dilapidated, and indeed it does need some help, although now structurally it is not going to fall down. There is an internal courtyard, again featured in the film. Next slide, please. And seen here at the time when Heinrich lived there, named here as the Kuchenhof, kitchen yard. But in fact, actually it's Kuchenhof, isn't it? But in fact, it was the internal courtyard around which everything happened. And at the picture's centre is a pillared structure, I don't know if you can see it, with the main water source for the castle. And in the photo on the right, there is that detail of the water source as it is now. We think it was the only source of water within the castle. Next slide, please. And here is the archway connecting the main building to another wing of the castle, with a family coat of arms above it. And there is another stone engraving. Next slide, please. This one, erected at the time of Franz and Marie Coudenhove's, and it refers to Franz's wife, Marie, whose money helped buy and restore the castle to its former glory. And in case you're getting confused, my family cast list consists of 5. The first Coudenhove owners, Franz and Marie, their eldest son, Heinrich, and his wife, Mitsu, and briefly, his second son, Richard. And Marie died before she was 40. And her son, Heinrich, then 17, was devastated by her death. Next slide, please. And here it is on the right, a little later. All his life, he wore a locket of Marie's hair around his neck and asked for it to be buried with him. Heinrich is, in my eyes, as fascinating as his more famous son, Richard. And I'm so pleased to have read recently a piece in English on Heinrich, wonderfully researched by Petra Pavlec, director of the Czech National Heritage Institute. Heinrich's diplomatic postings ranged from South America to the Middle East. On one, Constantinople, he rescued an Armenian from a Turkish mob, Babik, who traveled with Heinrich as his factotum and remained devoted to him for the rest of his life. In February 1892, Heinrich arrived in Tokyo, and within a fortnight, he had purchased a beautiful 17-year-old girl, Mitsuko Aoyama, from a well-to-do merchant. He took her to the embassy as a maid, his maid. She quickly bore him 2 sons there, Johannes and then Richard. And when Father Franz died, the terms of the will bypassed Heinrich to his firstborn legitimate son. To benefit from this, Mitsuko had to quickly convert and then marry Heinrich to retrospectively legitimize the 2 boys so that the eldest could inherit the states back in Europe. On Franz's death, they traveled back halfway around the world to Ronsberg in stages, Singapore, India, Jerusalem, and then a papal blessing in Rome. And all of this fascinating story is in the biography of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. Next slide, please. And here we have all of them. There's Mitsuko, Mitsu, as she was called by the family, and she went on to have 5 more children. And here they all are, left to right. Mitsu holding the youngest boy, Eri, in her arms. Next to her in the back row are Johannes, then Richard and Gerolf. And in the front are Elizabeth, Olga and Ida. And they spent most of their childhood in Ronsberg, although Mitsu preferred the comfort of the smaller Dianahof and Stockau. Heinrich was a modernizer, and he did install central heating in Ronsberg. Next slide, please. Here we are. We can see an example of the heating here in the library, the radiator on the right. And Heinrich used the library as his study. His sons were allowed to find any books they chose. And here's Richard up on the library steps. Heinrich had a flair for languages. He was fluent in over a dozen. And at dinners in Ronsberg, he hosted mullahs, rabbis, artists. Conversation was widely liberal, and their sons were allowed to listen and to learn. And Richard continued his studies in his room, illustrated here. According to Petr Pavlich's research, Heinrich had wanted to transform Ronsberg into a small academy of arts and languages with male and female professors. That would have been truly wonderful. Next slide, please. We do need to use our imagination to conjure all that up. This is the entrance hall we saw. The castle was used by border guards after 1948 and allowed to deteriorate. Dianahof was one of the targets for their light artillery and is now in ruins. And Stockau too is overgrown rubble, sadly. Luckily, a demolition order for Ronsberg made in the 1980s was never carried out. Thanks to the Velvet Revolution, the castle became the property of the local authority. In 1991, with state support, reconstruction was begun in phases under local authority supervision, using grants, including many from Japan. And as you will see, there is still a little way to go. Next slide, please. Here you can see partial restoration, and you may remember the turret from the external images. But beyond the fundamental structural work, there has also been internal work. Next slide, please. On the walls, the recent restorers have revealed frescoes. This is just one example. We saw a couple in the film. This is a seated king judging by his crown and scepter, and we were told 15th century in the film. Next slide, please. Here are more frescoes, and these are displayed rather than revealed, and they include hunting scenes. And they are in some of the rooms which have been made structurally sound and also rewired. You can see the wires poking out, I think. Next slide, please. But there was, in 2016, still a lot of work to be done. Let me come back to the final element of my part of the Coudenhove story. Next slide, please. Heinrich died suddenly, aged 47. His monumental gravestone is one of the few large ones standing in the Catholic cemetery, with a simple inscription on his gravestone: Heinrich Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, born Vienna, 12 October 1859, died Ronsberg, 14 May 1906. No mention of the estates or the rest of his titles, and of course, no mention of the huge impact Heinrich had on his son Richard. That legacy is partly redressed by the plaque erected at the visitor entrance, which reads, next slide please, "In Ronsberg Castle lived Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, father of the idea of a united Europe, unveiled at the time of the Czech accession to the EU, May 2004. Well, it's actually April, but doesn't matter. How and where this son of Povacevice travelled on from Ronsberg, I will leave to Martyn to explain. I've only provided a few castle illustrations to excite your imagination to work. And next year, 2023, the centenary of the first publication of his ideas, the castle therefore represents an important opportunity, not only for Povacevice, but also in European heritage terms, to highlight the remarkable achievements of Richard and perhaps realise Heinrich's dream of an academy. With that thought, I'll hand over to Martyn. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Claudia. That's a very nice introduction. You've given us a lot of delightful colour in the first element of the evening's topic. And certainly you stressed the role of Heinrich, the father of Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, Richard Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, who was an incredibly important influence on his son. the son was in fact only 11 years old when his father died, and he obviously idolized this image, but he had learnt an awful lot before he became 11, and he carried a lot of that with him throughout his life. But before I deal with the Count or Richard or Dicky, I'd like to have a quick look at Mitsu, his mother's life, because there's something very interesting also that he takes from the Japanese half of the family. Mitsu, his Japanese mother, was widowed in 1906 at her husband's death, and she was aged only 32 with 7 children. Now, the wider Coudenhove family feared that she might return to Tokyo. She was remarkably good looking. So let's have a look at the first slide. Thank you. There's Mitsu dressed in a European fashion. And not surprisingly, the wider Coudenhove family feared that she might find a new husband in Japan. The Coudenhove fortune then would have been lost. So they asked for a court order to impose a guardian, a male member of the family, to look after her financial affairs as well as her children's education. She was obviously a lost little foreign soul and female anyway, and couldn't possibly cope with such a heavy burden. She defended her rights herself in court, charmed the judge and won her case, an exceptional outcome for that time. And quite accidentally, perhaps, a century later, this has made her an icon of women's lib back in Japan, with large amount of literature written about her, a great deal of fiction, to be fair, and very little of it based on fact. But the key element, this great assertion of her personality when she was widowed. So the meek and docile wife, who had come with her husband and produced 7 children in little more than 10 years, now became a strict and demanding widow. As head of her own family, she demanded Japanese obedience from all her children, sacked incompetent staff immediately, and made key decisions herself. For greater privacy and to avoid some of the sad memories of the castle, she also moved with her 3 daughters and infant son to Stockau, the Cistercian abbey which they had converted, and she sent her 3 eldest boys, aged 12, 13 and 14, to the Theresianum in Vienna, which was the Eton, like, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Next slide, please. This is Dicky, a little bit later than the time I'm talking about, but not much, and you can see his good looks as well. While he was just 18, actually, just leaving school, the very term in which he left school, his mother introduced him to a new friend of hers. She was very socially active in Vienna, and this was a powerful older woman. Next slide, please. A famous Jewish actress, Ida Roland. For Dicky, it was love at first sight, and Ida reciprocated. Within a few weeks, they were an item, initially tolerated by the family, an older actress and younger student affair. But not when Dicky announced his intention to marry. That changed everything. Mitsu now called her a witch, a cradle snatcher, a social climber aiming to marry a title. All to absolutely no avail. The couple were open about their intentions, attended the Vienna Derby in June 1914 and the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth that summer, just before the outbreak of war. Then they lived quietly together in Linz, and at Easter 1915 were discreetly married, as it were, by a friendly friar in the chapel of the Nymphenburg Palace in Munich. That gives you an idea of the level at which they were moving around in society. Ida was earning astronomical sums as a famous actress. They were also both pacifists, and at that time no one knew who would win the war. But Dicky was sure that Europe would lose. And in 1918, that became absolutely clear. The Versailles settlement the following year created 12 new states based on the principle of self-determination. It created a weak, impoverished Europe of independent and antagonistic nations. Next slide, please. Dicky put his mind to devising a better scheme than the status quo of competing small states. In October 1923, he wrote his political programme, Pan-Europa, a clarion call to create a united Europe in the place of dozens of competing nations. For Dicky, it was self-evident that the continent had to be united if it was to count in post-war world dominated by Soviet Russia in the east and the United States of America in the west. Communist on one side, extreme capitalism on the other. Next slide, please. If you stood back and looked at the world as a whole, geopolitics was the name of this very new branch of study at that time, you could imagine in the 1920s 5 great power centers at global level. Capitalist America, north and south, away on the left of the map. Communist Russia, that was the second power, stretching across the top right of the map. The British Empire was the third, spread throughout the globe. Hard to see that hatching, but look at India, the vertical hatching, Australia as well, Canada and so forth. A power center in the Far East, China, Japan and Korea could be a fourth, independent from colonial powers, and a fifth could be Pan-Europa, marked here in black. It would be made up of its European states and also all their extensive colonies throughout Africa and Asia. At that time, they would be as rich and as strong as the British Empire. Each power would be responsible for peace, each of these 5 within their own sphere of influence, and together they would ensure peace at world level. That way, there would be no Second World War. Dickey's new Pan-Europa needed, however, some structure. It needed a Supreme Court to settle disputes between member states, a legislature where the people of Europe as a whole could make their laws, a customs union, a single market, a common currency, free movement to stimulate research and the arts, and armed forces to protect Europe from foreign aggression, as well as to police the application of court decisions to keep the law. Sounds remarkably familiar, and this was 1923. Next slide, please. Pan-Europa also needed symbols to create a sense of European identity in the public mind, and Dickey and Ida were experts at public relations. They wanted to inspire European patriotism. They invented this flag and chose an anthem, not surprisingly Beethoven's Ode to Joy, to encourage this European identity. It was flown everywhere the Pan-Europa supporters came together, and Beethoven's Ode to Joy was played. In conferences, national committees, on parades and marches, members even wore small pin badges in their jackets and dresses. This flag was printed on all the books and pamphlets that they produced. But they knew they needed more than just a flag and the trimmings. They needed a big political figure to take this further. The Versailles settlement made Dickey a citizen of the new Czechoslovakia, so he first took his idea to the Czech president. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk agreed with him, but declared he was unfortunately too old and too busy with his new responsibilities to take on this leadership of a European project. But he and his foreign minister, Beneš, did give Dickey and Ida diplomatic passports and help support Pan-Europa financially. The peace movement in Germany, led by Hermann Fried, also publicized his ideas, as did the Freemasons in Vienna, and a member of his lodge, Louis Rothschild, introduced Dickey to Max Warburg, the Hamburg banker who generously bankrolled the project for the first 3 years. Next slide, please. Warburg had good reason to support Pan-Europa, and he's right there in the middle of the picture. Just a fortnight after Dickey published his book in Vienna, Hitler mounted the beer hall putsch in Munich. Publicity around his subsequent trial made him a public figure in German-speaking Europe. While he was serving his short prison sentence, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a program for German domination of the continent. He was well aware of Richard's Pan-Europa movement and its alternative idea of a peaceful union. The new professor of geopolitics at Munich University, Klaus Haushofer, a family friend of the Coudenhoves, had shown Hitler Dickey's book. Dickey and Hitler now recognized that they were political rivals with mutually exclusive visions for Europe's future. Next slide, please. This is the hard stuff. We only have a couple of slides like this. Most of them are pictorial. Dickey and Ida set up branches of Pan-Europa in Paris, Berlin, Rome, and a dozen other capitals. They also visited Britain and America to establish support groups there. Meanwhile, Hitler was consolidating his power base inside Germany. In Mein Kampf, he explicitly attacked Pan-Europa, calling Richard a cosmopolitan bastard, the title I used for my biography. Their publications rivaled each other throughout the 1920s, and Dickey's were actually more popular than Hitler's. The manuscript of the third volume of Mein Kampf was refused by his publisher because so much stock of Hitler's first 2 volumes was still unsold. Dickey and Ida organized international political congresses, the first in Vienna in 1926, then 1930 in Berlin, Basel in 32. They called them congresses of nations, not of governments. The European intelligentsia flocked to them in their thousands. Thomas Mann, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, Richard Strauss amongst them. Dickey declared that everyone in Europe who was neither a communist nor a nationalist should support Pan-Europa as the only peaceful solution for Europe's future. Next slide, please. Just for a moment, both Germany and France were also on board, supporting Dickey's ideas. Aristide Briand, on the left here, many times Prime Minister of France, became the honorary president of Pan-Europa. At a League of Nations meeting in Geneva in September 29, Briand proposed a form of federal link between neighbouring states in Europe, and Gustav Stresemann, the sterner-looking gentleman on the right, the long-serving foreign minister of Weimar Germany, responded positively. Sadly, it turned out to be too little and too late. This high-level government initiative was overtaken by events. Only a little later, Stresemann suffered a fatal heart attack, and the Wall Street crash ushered in the Great Depression. As unemployment grew, Nazi support soared. Next slide, please. When Hitler assumed power in Germany, the Nazis immediately closed down Dickey's Pan-Europa movement, seized its assets, and burnt his books. Now that Germany was lost to him, Pan-Europa aligned itself with the Austrian government, supporting its key foreign policy, which was to keep the country independent. Pan-Europa had offices in the Hofburg, right next door to the Chancellor's office. But this policy cost Chancellor Adolphus his life, assassinated by Austrian Nazis in 1934. His successor, Chancellor Schuschnigg, was also targeted. He came to dinner with Dickey and Ida in their apartment in Vienna, but fortunately the pro-Nazi butler's nerve failed him, and he threw the bomb in the nearby canal instead. A lucky escape. In 1938, eventually Hitler annexed Austria. Dickey and Ida narrowly escaped with their lives. The Nazis evidently played politics by different rules. Next slide. Dickey and Ida fled first to Switzerland, where they had a country house near Gstaad, but they were also often in Paris and in London. Dickey lectured at Chatham House on the new situation in Central Europe, lunched with Leo Amery, Duff Cooper and Churchill, and was invited to Chartwell. He became a valuable and trusted advisor, travelling to and from the continent and bringing Churchill useful information right up to the end of the phony war in May 1940. In June that year, Dickey and Ida eventually fled across France and neutral Spain to Lisbon. They applied for visas both to Britain and to the United States from Lisbon, but the Americans said yes first and whisked them to New York in August 1940. Next slide, please. When Hollywood came to make Casablanca a few years later, Dickey's network of political contacts and his history of opposition to Hitler made him the model for Victor Laszlo. The high-minded, action-oriented character of the handsome young protagonist, in touch with all the anti-Nazi leaders across the continent, fitted Dickey like a glove. The actor who played the role, Paul Henriet, was also at school with Dickey's younger brother, Eri, the one who was the babe in arms in the photo of the family, and the families knew each other well in Vienna. And in the final scene of Casablanca, Laszlo escapes to neutral Lisbon, just as Dickey did. Dickey always painted the big picture and always aimed high. And in America, he tried to convince President Roosevelt that the battle in Europe wasn't just against Hitler and the Nazis. Eventually, he could see that it would be against Stalin and the communists. That was unwelcome news to Roosevelt, who knew at that time that the war could not be won without Stalin's support. He kept Dickey at arm's length, but, next slide. With his successor, President Truman, in 1945, things were very different. Truman went on record as saying that the United States of Europe was, quote, an excellent idea. It could be a bulwark against Soviet domination of the continent. And George Marshall, his Secretary of State, accepted Dickey's advice about the criteria for distributing Marshall aid. European states had to organize a joint approach to qualify for support. Aid would only be delivered according to a joint plan that involved all the subscribing states. And those of you with Czech background, obviously, and an interest in Czech affairs know very well that Czechoslovakia was excluded from that effort simply because it was at that stage already under communist control. 1948. At this point, let me slide back for a moment, leaving Dickie to one side, and revert to his older brother, Johannes, the eldest brother, who was the one who inherited the estate and lived in Ronsburg, what's now Bohemia. Europe was collapsing all around him in the closing months of that First World War, but he petitioned the Emperor Karl to upgrade his social status. It was obviously very important for him. He had this small memorial. Can I see the next slide, please? This small memorial fixed to the castle wall to commemorate his ascent to a higher grade of nobility with the title von Ronsberg-Heim. Clearly his Germanic roots mattered to him. In 1938, he welcomed the outcome of the Munich negotiations and the subsequent incorporation of the Sudetenland into the German Reich. But he was neither a stable nor a rational man. His wife, Lili Sternschneider-Wertheim, was Jewish from Budapest, and they had a daughter called Pixie. Under Nazi law, Hansi was classified as fully Aryan, but both the women remained Jewish. Hansi used his political influence to have his wife and daughter reclassified, but he failed. And in 1939, he was forced to send them to hide in Italy until the coming war was over. Meanwhile, he continued his pro-Nazi activities, both in Ronsberg and Berlin. He was really living an extraordinary Jekyll and Hyde existence. Next slide, please. Here is Hansi. He took Nazi myth-making really to an extreme. This painting that he had made of him is him reclining resplendent in pseudo-Germanic knight's costume. And it's in the nearby chateau just up the road, 10-15 miles away, just east from Bohemia, and can be visited. But at the end of the war, it was a different story for him. Once the Americans had passed through Ronsberg, Czech partisans arrested him and interned him in the local concentration camp at Krasavice. He was treated very harshly, not surprisingly, frankly, considering his long-standing Nazi sympathies and his local status. It was months later, at the end of 1945, before Dickie, who was still in New York, heard of his brother's arrest. But he immediately cabled President Benesch, Prime Minister Vierlinger, and Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, all of whom he knew personally, to ask their help. Hansi's case, however, was serious. He was charged before a revolutionary tribunal with high treason, collaborating with the enemy, a charge that could carry the death penalty. In the end, Hansi's life was saved by the dissolution of that temporary revolutionary tribunal in 1947, when it was replaced by a regular regional court which couldn't impose the death penalty. And earlier the following year, Hansi was simply expelled from the country across the border, as Dickie had requested, to the American zone of Germany. The castle was by then, as you've heard, in state hands and used by border guards. Next slide, please. If I leave the black sheep of the family and return to Dickie, Dickie's good relations with Churchill paid dividends after the war. He had lunch with him on the shores of Lake Geneva in August 1946, briefing him just before his dramatic Zurich speech on Europe. Churchill acknowledged his debt to him by name in that very speech. Dickie helped Churchill also to set up the European movement, and he spoke immediately after him at the Congress of Europe in The Hague in May 1948. This is the picture of that event. It shows Churchill at the microphone and Dickie seated at the very far left. I trust you can see that on your screens, beyond, I believe, the Dutch princess with the flowers in front of her. Dickie is to the left. If Churchill was seen at that time as the saviour of Europe after the Second World War, well, certainly of Western Europe after the Second World War, Dickie was the prophet who had preached this cause of a united Europe since the end of the First. In this context, they shared the laurels, and Dickie's hand was in many of the initiatives taken in those years. In 1947, he set up a European Parliamentary Union, which lobbied governments to agree the Treaty of London that established the Council of Europe. That incorporated the first Europe-wide Parliamentary Assembly, main aim of his idea that the peoples of Europe should make the laws for Europe. In 1949 and 1950, he also initiated the first joint meetings of parliamentarians from France and the new state of West Germany. And as a result, he was awarded both the Légion d'honneur and the Bundesverdienstkreuz. Next slide, please. And he was the very first recipient of the Charlemagne Prize in 1950. awarded to him for his tireless efforts in the cause of European unity. In his acceptance speech, Dickey stressed the cultural unity of Europe, East and West, despite the existence of the Iron Curtain and the loss of Czechoslovakia by then to the communists. He demanded that efforts to unite Western Europe should never forget the incomplete nature of the West European project. Slide of next one, please. Thank you. Only a fortnight before Dickey received the Charlemagne Prize, Jean Monnet launched the idea of a European coal and steel community. That's how close those two events were. And it was Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister at the time, who said, Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create de facto solidarity. That became the community method, pursued extremely successfully by Jean Monnet within that small original grouping. The six powered ahead, and soon other countries, including Britain, wanted to join what grew to become the common market. Next slide, please. Dickey welcomed this initiative, but he had doubts about both the method and the scope. He had a grander vision, and that implied a more fundamental decision by states to pool their sovereignty in more than just coal and steel. And this book that he published in 1953, for instance, with the dramatic title Die Europäische Nation, well illustrates that difference. For Dickey, Europe, both East and West, should see itself as one nation, the European nation. Latin, Slav, and Germanic nations all belong to the same culture, the same continent, and should share a European nationality. To give that awareness political expression, the individual states of the continent should decide consciously to create a United States of Europe. He shared this broader European vision with de Gaulle, with whom he conducted lengthy correspondence from the end of the Second World War until his death in 1970. And for many years, he also received a pension from de Gaulle's private office. Next slide, please. I move very quickly. 2 years after de Gaulle's death, the indefatigable Dickey also died, by then in his late 70s. The inscription on his gravestone reads, Pioneer of the United States of Europe. It was Otto von Habsburg who took over the leadership of the Pan-Europa movement after Dickey's death, and he wrote, if one day Europe is really united, the people of our continent will owe it to Coudenhove in much greater measure than they are prepared to admit today. And it was Dickey's formative years with his father and mother in the castle in Ronsburg that had taught him to think in terms of continents, not countries. He was happy there and simply wrote in a later memoir that Ronsburg was paradise. What better praise could a famous son give to his home? Next slide, please. Since the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the question of European unity has obviously required a new answer. And the EU has expanded to create a single economic space across the continent. But that doesn't yet have a political identity that matters. The big issues that really do matter, security, foreign policy, defence, taxation, even the choice of energy sources, remain firmly national. Dickey would recognise immediately that this is the reason why, in the contemporary world of global superpowers, Europe is still absent. Dickey and Ida could declare themselves European patriots. Wouldn't it be good if more Europeans could say the same today? That's why I wrote this biography of the Count, and I hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you.
Martyn and Claudia, thank you very much indeed. I thought that was inspirational, absolutely inspirational. And that's quite remarkable how well aligned his thoughts were with his, somehow he had the right ideas and he pursued the right ideas, and they still have legitimacy, which I find very interesting indeed. So, I mean, so many political ideas just fall by the wayside. We have, I think, a few minutes for some questions, and I would like to ask David whether we've had some questions come up. Have we, David? Can I throw it open to the floor then?
Madame, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. I just want to know how Mitsu came to be in Europe.
Claudia, would you like to do that part of the story?
Yes, basically when Heinrich found that the family was going to have to inherit, because and it was bypassing him and going straight to his son, so she travelled back with her husband, Heinrich, at the time, all the way back. And you know, she had to submit, and she was horrified in a way by this, but her father said she had an overwhelming sense of duty now to her husband. And so that's how she came back to Ronsburg, and adopted European dress. And we understand she had some understanding of German and some less of English. We saw some letters that she wrote. But the amazing thing for me was that she managed to walk into a court in Germany and defend, presumably in German, not in Japanese, her right to hang on to the estates and to supervise her family. And can I just make one comment? Martyn and I have a slightly different approach to Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, I think I'll say. You can correct me. I'm a little bit more positive about him, I think, than you are. He did this European Parliamentary Union. He brought together 150 MPs, all right, from parliaments across Europe, large contingent from the French, I think 43, a reasonable contingent from the Brits and Italy as well, to see what they could do. And it really was due to what he was doing there, that these people went back to their governments, their parliaments, and lobbied. And what emerged then was the Council of Europe. And he was very sad that the Brits, in fact, stopped it having a parliamentary assembly and, in fact, a constitution which would be as active as he wanted it to be.
There's a follow-up question on this. Oh, there's another one coming since. How did they meet? Was she in Japan and they met there?
Well, yes. Basically, there are two versions of this, and you'll find it in the book. I don't really want to. It's a wonderful version, which is the mythical one. But we think that he went into an antique dealer shop, and she served tea, and he was duly smitten. There is another much more dramatic version, which is also in the book, and I will not give that one away because you really do need to get this book. And basically he fell in love, or maybe not fell in love, but anyway, certainly wanted to have her, and he bought her. It was a trade transaction, really.
Yes, along with the furnishings for the new embassy. He was sent to set up the embassy.
You're quite right.
Hence, he was in the antique dealer's place, antique and furniture. And he saw something which was certainly not antique and certainly not furniture, and he had plenty of money, and that was the custom. So she became his concubine, and that had to be legitimized later in order that the inheritance could be legal.
Which is why Hitler, of course, called him a bastard.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Next one is from Jan, who has a question for Martyn. Would you say that Count Coudenhove-Kalergi and his vision of united Europe was based rather on his roots in the multinational Habsburg Empire or the historical experience of the World Wars, Great Depression and collapse of interwar regimes?
Well, certainly his experience is the First World War, and that's where his ideas are formed. He's that much younger and that much more impressionable anyway, but he is not serving, he doesn't serve. And we have a very good record from his next younger brother, Gerolf, who's called up in 1915 and is keen to go and does serve in various fronts, but especially on the Italian front. And when he was 80, he wrote his memoirs, and there's some very moving passages, which I quote in the book, about him at the front and what he learns, and when he came back on furlough and what he did on furlough. And they met, quite clearly they met and they spoke, but there's no record of what was actually in the exchange. So he would have known about the war through family extension, but his concern was much more, and I think this is very true, to have something as united, if not more united, than the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. There is a nostalgia for a completeness for Europe, and that was what he knew about as a young boy. That's where he lived. You can sense a little bit of this nostalgia, but it doesn't, dare I say, it doesn't mark what he says in practice. What he's talking about is very modern. He's very keen on modern technology, sees that things like broadcasting and mass media have totally changed the world after the First World War as compared to before, and that politics has also changed and external relations have changed. As the world shrinks, so you need these big forces to keep peace. You can't do it with the lots of little ones. Lovely.
Mark asks you to say more on Coudenhove's correspondence with de Gaulle. Did they meet in person? And are there records of de Gaulle's written correspondence, particularly between 1947 and 1958, when de Gaulle was out of power? De Gaulle's Europe de Patrie was not a pan-European federation, and he was motivated by restoring France's world state power status. He says his uncle, Francois Coulet, was an aide-de-camp of de Gaulle in 1942 and served him in the winding up of Algérie Française in 1959 to 61.
Very nice. Well, let me start towards the end of that. Yes, you're absolutely right. Their views didn't coincide about this, but they both exchanged their views with each other on numerous occasions. And the sympathy was there from Coudenhove for de Gaulle. I mean, Coudenhove liked strong leaders. That's what he wanted. That's one of the big attractions of Churchill, was that he was a strong leader and he could respond to him and could be an advisor to him. And he played a similar role for de Gaulle. The correspondence is published. The Fondation Charles de Gaulle has published the complete correspondence, something like 150 letters, something like that. And Fondation Charles de Gaulle, if you find them, you'll find it. And the difference in approach to Europe, yes, you're right, Europe des Patries, but an important element in the Europe des Patries concept of de Gaulle was that Europe needed strong leadership. And his notion of patrie was the big states of Europe would lead it, not the little ones. He wouldn't be dictated to by Luxembourg, let alone now, let's say, by Malta or other smaller states as have come into the community now, into the Union now. But he wanted a directoire and was quite prepared at one stage to have 4 countries in the directoire. It could have been Britain, France, Germany and Italy. It wasn't in Britain, and then there was a quarrel, and he kept the Brits out from the next round. But just to qualify that, in the advice and in the correspondence, you'll find that Coudenhove shared and thought he was right to say no to Britain in the first time that he vetoed our entry, and that he was wrong when it came to the second time. And they were prepared to discuss that.
Can I just add a bit? You asked about the relationship. They did call each other mon cher ami.
Yeah.
That was the way they started their correspondence.
Oh, thank you very much. Is there anything, I think we're getting to the point now where we perhaps ought to be letting our speakers go and have a drink. I'm sorry that we can't actually join you with, as we would normally do in the Czech embassy, but that isn't. We wish you well. So with a drink, and if there's nothing else, then I would very much like to thank you for this actually excellent evening. I think it's been really very, very interesting indeed. And I personally have bought the book, and I've glanced at it, and I recommend it to you. It's very easily obtained. You just need to go to your local bookshop, and all the details are, I'm sure you've got them already. So please do buy the book. So once again, thank you very much indeed, Claudia and Martyn, for being with us this evening.